I have only tried my hand in a number of areas which are all related and have tried to lead a life that is sort of connected with this kind of thinking and work. But I wouldn't call myself a universal man. I know much too little.
Herbert Bayer, painter, sculptor, designer, typographer, architect, humanitarian. In his 75th year, one of the few living masters of the original Bauhaus.
The Bauhaus, of course, implanted in me such a sense of duty, you can say, not to just go and paint for my own pleasure, but to devote myself to dealing with the design problems of our time. It were the years of the birth of design. And so I have worked mostly in these areas of design, graphic design, communication, exhibition design, photography, and so on. But I have always painted.
Bayer has always considered himself to be primarily a painter. His painting is the continuous link which connects the various facets of his work. For almost 30 years, Bayer and his wife Joella have lived in Aspen, Colorado, where he is a founding fellow of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. Here, the grandeur of the mountains, the clarity of the air, the isolation from the bustle of the city give freedom to the creative mind. And here Bayer has maintained a special relationship which has influenced and sustained him from his earliest days. A relationship with nature.
I've never been a city boy. I grew up in small places. So, to me, nature means something. If I am tired or up against something I don't have a solution, I go for a walk, and this communion with nature is important to me.
Out of this communion, he has drawn the inspiration for artistic expression of almost incredible scope, involving many disciplines, and yet infused with a congruity of thought and principle which unites them in a coherent image. The measure of Herbert Bayer, the man and his work. Herbert Bayer was born in 1900 in the Austrian village of Haag, in the country, about 50 miles from Salzburg. His father was a tax collector, his mother an innkeeper's daughter. He grew up tuned to the seasons and slow rhythms of peasant life, and his first paintings reflected the things he saw on mountain climbing trips and long walks through the countryside. Bayer developed a love for nature that would influence the rest of his life.
This series of paintings I call archaic because they have their origin in my wanderings through the country and life with the peasants. There one can see all sorts of interesting forms and shapes, agricultural implements or instruments like forks or ladders, ropes strung over big hooks, wheels, and so on.
Bayer used used these forms as the basis for paintings and soft-form wall sculptures, adapting them as elements in his own surrealistic interpretations. He would use the same shapes in the medium of photomontage some 20 years later. The Baroque also had a great influence on Bayer's becoming an artist.
Baroque traditions, I feel, were at the time still alive in the music, in the life of the peasants, in their dresses, and naturally going to church. One always was in a Baroque environment. But the entire life had a character still of the Baroque, the ornamented.
Bayer went to high school in Linz. Then, after serving in the army during the First World War, he moved to Germany, where he became apprenticed to a fellow Austrian, Emanuel Margold, an architect in the artist colony at Darmstadt. Bayer continued his painting, but he also used his skill for the first time in the decorative arts and in package design. He was introduced to the idea that artists could design for visual communication. While in Darmstadt, he made a discovery which would change the course of his life.
I ran across Kandinsky's book about the spiritual in art, which he had written in 1911 or so. And that excited me very much. And then I saw the first manifesto of the Bauhaus, on the cover of which was a woodcut of Lionel Feininger, sort of symbolizing the cathedral of socialism.
The Bauhaus has become one of the legends of the 20th century, and to work there was to go in at the very root of modernism. Among the chief teachers were Walter Gropius, the great purist architect who was the father of the functional style, and Paul Klee, the Swiss painter, whose theories of art and how young painters might start thinking about art would influence art teaching for another 50 years. Some years later, Bayer, returning to the Bauhaus archives in Berlin for a retrospective of his work, recalled the essence of the Bauhaus philosophy.
In the Bauhaus, we believed that art as such cannot really be taught. You can teach the fundamentals of composition, the fundamentals of color, and basic knowledge, the alphabet with which you make a painting or an image. But you cannot teach inspiration and talent. It has to be there. The teacher, painter, did not teach his students to paint the picture as he did, to make little masters out of the big master. That was the academic approach against which we turned.
The Bauhaus began in Weimar, an ideal city for the beginnings of an artistic movement.
Weimar has been the seat of German poetry, of statesmanship, of culture in general. The Bauhaus was located right near the big park, where there was also Goethe's garden house, where he spent the summers. The garden was of a typical romantic design with an artificial ruin and things like that. But very beautiful and it added to our romantic life at the Bauhaus. We had regular dances on weekends. There were always happenings because unrehearsed, unexpected, unplanned things took place. We also pulled some jokes on the bourgeoisie in Weimar, and so there were certain objections to us. It was all too radical. It was not completely in the tradition of the Guild. Our thinking was different. But they also had suspicions politically. They thought we were communists, which we were not, we were non-political. The Bauhaus were at its beginning a school. It was founded as a school, which found a way to train the artist for the machine age.
The basic lesson taught in the workshops of the Bauhaus was that all art activity lives in a matrix of craft. There wasn't any separation between so-called fine art and so-called applied art. By learning to deal with every sort of design problem, from paintings to spoons, the Bauhaus students learned to use the new technology of their culture, beginning with the basic building blocks of shape and color.
At the Bauhaus, the idea of the triangle, square, and the circle, and it has three primary forms, to which belong the three primary colors, was an element that played much of a role in everything that was done. He was breaking it down to the essentials.
Bayer was also influenced and inspired by the people he worked with at the Bauhaus.
There was a community spirit from being with students who wanted the same thing, and knowing teachers, from talking to the teachers. Today I would call that spirit was the quality that I received from the Bauhaus. I learned how to work. Well, I have always been a disciplined person, but the Bauhaus taught that, because you learn by doing things.
Especially Bayer worked as a wall painter, making big mural projects, learning the large scale, executing, as he did in 1922, a mural by Wassily Kandinsky, the great Russian abstract painter. The Bauhaus encouraged new media. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, one of the teachers, got his students to experiment with photography, which before had never been part of art school training. And because the Bauhaus philosophy insisted that everything we see, touch, or use was a subject for design, it paid great attention to typography, the form of letters, the layout.
I did typography at the Bauhaus in 1922. Photography perhaps started 2 years later. From then on, it was a logical thing to use both these mediums in all graphic communication. It is particularly compatible with advertising psychology and the imagery of ideas.
The most difficult problem Bayer set himself in this field, decades later, was not just designing a new typeface, but working out a new alphabet based on phonetics, which he hoped would communicate faster and more clearly than conventional ones by telescoping letters and sounds. Typography had a role in everything. In 1923, inflation hit the Weimar Republic so swiftly that new money was needed with no time for traditional hand engraving. Bayer was asked to design the new money using typography in a single weekend.
And it had to be ready on Monday morning. It was distributed still wet from the printing press. It started with 1 million and went up to something like 500 million, 1,000 million, until the complete breakdown came.
The fabric of German life was coming apart. There was less and less security during the inflation years. Public services ran down. Rational planning stopped. And Germany was entering its dance of death. People were getting more conservative and flocking to the side of a failed Austrian paperhanger turned politician. A new breed of thugs was appearing. The Nazis were gathering strength. In 1923, Bayer took a year's leave of absence from the Bauhaus and hiked through Italy, working as a house painter, sketching and painting. The seashore and countryside gave him inspiration. As in his childhood in Austria, the contact with nature and Italy's ordered landscape left a lasting imprint upon him. By the time he returned to Weimar in 1924, the Nazis were making life so difficult there that preparations were being made to relocate the Bauhaus. Of the 3 cities that applied to get the Bauhaus, Dessau was chosen because it offered a chance to build a new building for the school and a few houses for the masters to live in. The Bauhaus had moved not only physically, but philosophically toward more rational thinking. The approach became more analytical, more practical. The emphasis lay less on traditional, static art forms and more on artistic expression through the new technologies. Bayer continued to paint, but he also explored new avenues of visual communication. Bayer became a master at the Bauhaus in 1925 and continued as head of the printing workshop for 3 years. But then, in 1928, he made a decision to leave.
I personally decided to leave the Bauhaus because I felt too young to teach.
He decided to move to Berlin, where he could put into practice the theories he had learned. He continued to work on typographical design. And he became absorbed by a fresh field, the design of exhibitions, the welding of many objects and messages into a communicative whole inside one space.
Exhibition design had evolved in the late 1920s and early 30s as a new discipline, one that incorporates all other mediums, such as architecture, color and design and proportion and shape. In exhibitions, the exhibits were usually hung on the wall, vertically. But I saw possibilities of including not only the vertical walls, but also the ceiling and also the floor. If you raise the visitor on a platform or a ramp, you can include all that surrounds him. And I call this extension of vision. It was first exemplified an exhibition in Paris, 1930, of the German Werkbund, where I placed to express the serial character, industrially made furniture on the wall for the building workers' unions, which I did in collaboration with Gropius and Moholy-Nagy in Berlin in 1931. Exhibits were designed for a panoramic view as well as for close-up views.
Berlin had treated Bayer well, but as political conditions in Germany changed, so did Berlin, and before long a single presence seemed to dominate all thought.
I did not think that Adolf Hitler would last long. My friends always went to his speeches simply to have a gay evening, a funny evening, because he appeared simply as a crazy man.
With the rise of Nazism, the days of creativity and freedom of expression were numbered. The Bauhaus itself, hated by the Nazis for its liberal attitude, had its funds cut off and was then searched by stormtroopers. Students were soon creating protest art. And in 1933, the faculty, realizing that the Bauhaus could not exist within the Third Reich, voted to close its doors. An exodus of many of Germany's finest creative talents had begun. Then, with the Nazi invasion of Austria in 1938, Bayer also left. Wassily Kandinsky had gone to Chicago, where he hoped to start a new Bauhaus and have Bayer as a teacher. The project fell through, but by then, Bayer had arrived in America. Thanks to a false report from an official in Germany, he found his first experience on American soil somewhat humorous.
Going through the customs and the immigration officer, they kept me to the last. And the immigration, I had a guitar under my arms. I used to play the guitar. And he said, "Are you a musician?" And I said, "No, I am a painter." But he says, "I have a report that you are colorblind." He asked me, "What is this color?" And I said, "Of his uniform." And I told him exactly the kind of blue it was. And then he showed me a paper. And I said, "Well, that's white." And then he showed me this seal, this big seal, and I told him what sort of bright red this is. He said, "Okay, you're only partially colorblind, you can go."
New York in the late 30s was the modernist capital of the world, a Baghdad of the future, whose house style was Art Deco. It had a museum of modern art. It had a public sympathetic to the ideals of the Bauhaus, a small public but energetic. There were elements that appealed to Bayer, and yet, without any contact with nature, he felt ill at ease there, uprooted, foreign.
When I came to New York, I felt very strongly this overpowering, unmanageable organization to which I simply didn't take. It was interesting from the point of view of exchange with people, but I missed very much not being outdoors, and all I did in New York was always, how do I get out of a long weekend?
He found a working retreat in Long Island, where, once again, he could escape from the busyness of the city and be back with nature, refreshed, re-inspired. He found companionship in a circle of fellow artists, which included Alexander Calder, José Luis Sert, Fernand Léger, Mary Callery, Gideon, and others. And he began painting again. In his art, the things he loved in nature outdoors flowed into and pervaded the indoors of his studio. In 1938, Bayer supervised the installation of a big Bauhaus show at the temporary location of the Museum of Modern Art, the first complete assemblage in America of all facets of the Bauhaus experience. At the New York World's Fair in 1939, he collaborated on the design of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania exhibit, In 1943, he designed an exhibition, again for the Museum of Modern Art, which made full use of his principle of extension of vision, which he had developed years earlier. It was called Road to Victory, a show about America's struggle against fascism, directed by the photographer Edward Steichen. In 1944, Bayer designed an installation called Airways to Peace.
This was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art during the war to make the people familiar with the idea of a global concept. See, our world had suddenly become a global proposition because of the aeroplane. Maps are always distorted because you cannot flatten out the surface of a globe. But if you look at a large globe from the outside, you even see less. So I reversed it, and I made an outside-in globe.
Meanwhile, Bayer's long studies and practice in visual communication at the Bauhaus were having an influence on information processing in America. In 1934, in Berlin, Bayer had drawn a group of paintings based on an exhibition called Wonders of Life, visual explanations of the workings of the human organism. Later, in America, he did a similar visualization for Life magazine on reactions of the human brain. His work confirmed the importance of the artist as the visualizer, the communicator of information that could be transmitted no other way. He knew that the artist could explain things that the scientist and businessman could not.
It was in 1943 that Fortune magazine asked me to try a visual diagram or visualization of the traffic pattern over a major airport. And they had to look into the future of how to handle increased air traffic. And what I drew up was what they thought will happen in the next few years. Several times it happened that people said, "Well, when I looked through your work, you must have had the most marvelous clients." And I said, I haven't had any other clients that everybody else has. I have made very few compromises in Europe. When I came to New York, there I had to make compromises. But it is in part an educational duty for a designer to inject in these communication pieces higher standards of art and aesthetics.
Bayer accomplished this when he was asked to do a series of industrial advertisements, a series that ran for over 15 years in national magazines.
They were called Great Ideas of Western Man, and were not really advertising pages in the normal sense of this word. These pages presented statements of great men to which modern artists created a visual presentation or interpretation, ideas on the fundamental rights of and aspirations of man, about liberty, justice, government.
It was in 1946 that Walter Pepke, the chairman of the Container Corporation, invited Bayer to come and live in what was virtually a ghost town, the old mining village of Aspen, Colorado. World War II had brought some activity, training ski troops. Skiing was natural to the area. Skiing was also natural to Bayer from his early years in Austria. And development of Aspen as a ski resort would provide a viable economic basis upon which to build a future community. Aspen would be redeveloped, but Bayer would provide the framework of thought, design, and responsibility to direct it toward a cautious, restricted growth. With Bayer's influence, zoning and environmental controls would guide the growth. Even as a first step, he attempted to unify the old architecture through harmonious color schemes.
The rumor got around that I was restoring Aspen to its Victorian style, but that was completely incorrect. I would have never thought to reconstruct an architectural style that belongs to another age and to the requirements of a different time.
But some of the original was best preserved.
The Wheeler Opera House was built in the 90s, but had been burned when I first saw it. Just the curve of the balcony was left. I had a picture of the proscenium in an old folder of Aspen, and so I tried to restore the interior by free association, going by what I saw of the proscenium. Now it has been turned into a movie house.
At about the same time, Bayer took on the monumental task of designing a complete world geographic atlas. His inspiration for an approach to the atlas had originated some years earlier on a trip to New England.
In the 40s, during a visit to Vermont, I suddenly saw the mountains not in their textured and detailed shapes, but suddenly saw them as expressions of interior forces, as undulating forms whose motion is caused by the forces of time and geology.
The experience inspired Bayer and suggested to him the idea for the treatment of the Geographic Atlas, another medium for visual communication.
As the title suggests, it is a world atlas with a graphic treatment. I understood that all knowledge overlaps, and geographers, like other scientists, draw on related fields. The findings of geology, climatology, astronomy, sociology, and economics are therefore enlisted in this volume to provide correlated material to be fused into a coherent entity.
Later, he applied the same principles to a commission to do 2 maps for colonial Williamsburg.
I'm not a geographer, I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist who has the ability to translate facts and figures into the visual.
Bayer's intellectual environment came from the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, which sprang from the Goethe Bicentennial he helped to organize in 1949. It is a private, non-profit organization, a kind of open university designed to link ideas from different parts of the world and discuss the problems of modern man in relation to economics, science, politics, environment, and art. The whole human envelope. The first chairman of the Institute who invited Bayer to Aspen was Walter Pepke. His successor is Robert Anderson.
We would like to be an international forum in discussing any and all affairs that relate to the human welfare, the human cause, and particularly the role of the individual in an increasingly complex society. What would you add to that?
I really couldn't add to it more than I hope that this will not be a huge university with thousands of people. because this environment is not made for it. And I believe we have started as sort of a modest environment that is scaled to the human being, and if we have masses to cope with, this will be destroyed.
No big noise, just ripples.
No big noise, just ripples. And yet the ripples created by the Aspen Institute have become international in scope. Its branch in Berlin has been completed, with the interior design supervised by Bayer. And another branch is being planned for Hawaii. The original Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado, where Bayer is a trustee, is an anthology of his work as an architect. It is also rich with examples of his work in painting, sculpture, and other disciplines, which combine with the architecture and project the artistic into the practicality of daily life. Indeed, Bayer has designed the whole physical setting within which the Institute functions, with the buildings relatively low, modest in size, in scale with the human being, and spaced as far apart as practical. Open areas of natural vegetation and groomed park areas lie in between. Bayer's influence is also apparent in the interior spaces of the buildings. In addition to the basic contribution of the architectural arrangement, his paintings, sculptures, and expressions in interior design are everywhere. As an outgrowth of the Goethe bicentenary, Bayer designed a permanent music tent for the Music Associates of Aspen, a daring structure seating 1,500 people, slung on steel cables anchored deep in the ground. Anderson Park is another expression of Bayer's intention to have his art extend throughout the environment, to make it possible for people, even when they're simply taking a walk, to enjoy the stimulation of visual creativity. The red sculptures were created by Bayer's friend, the Mexican artist Matthias Goeritz. Water running through the park is at once beautiful and practical. It comes from irrigation ditches used for watering the plants and trees. The total effect lives in harmony with the natural elements of the environment, the sagebrush and the mountains. Away from Aspen, Bayer has designed other buildings, such as this private chapel for the Anderson home in New Mexico, done in 1962. Into it, he incorporated fragments of an older building, stone carvings from a Spanish Baroque church in Mexico. And he worked on broader civic and environmental projects, highways, for instance. Environmental designs by Bayer suggest the use of shape and color, integrated into the design of highways to make them transcend their basic role in transportation. Why should many highways exist as monotonous, unbroken concrete surfaces, without color, without innovation, without beauty? He applies the same principles used in designing for the highway to industry. Industry, Bayer feels, is the institution that reaches further into our civilization than government. The machine and mass production should be accepted as legitimate facets of the artist's total experience.
For some time now, I have been working on a rather unusual project, and that is the visual improvement of an oil refinery. I see this sort of problem arising everywhere. The industry generally has become very environmental conscious, and I believe that this kind of problem will in the future play an important role in the consciousness of the artist, designer, and architect, because they are the ones who could, with their knowledge and talent, contribute to the visual improvement of industrial installations.
Bayer's belief is that the artist should be involved not only in the shaping of individual objects of art, but also in the totality of design for an all-inclusive environment.
My aim with environmental design is to carry art and design from the privacy of the museum to the public around, bringing it closer to a greater majority.
Now, environmental design may be the art of the future, but sculpture is the art of the possible. And Bayer, especially in recent years, has been engaged in an exploration of a wide variety of sculptural forms. The shapes and sizes range from these smaller forms to these which he calls monumental sculptures. One of Bayer's realized projects is this twin spiral sculpture in Los Angeles. Leading the eye up from a pool of water, pausing and descending. He also designed movable sculptures that work as sun screens and windbreaks. And in Aspen, Bayer made an environmental piece from local stone. Frozen shapes set up as if on a vast tabletop. With his friend Matthias Goeritz, Bayer visits the work which he calls Marble Garden.
Well, Matthias, we have talked a great deal about the Marble Garden, and now I have you here.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. And the marble comes from here, from near?
Near here in a valley, there is an abandoned marble quarry. And I went there were all pieces lying around, they were just piled up. And I went up and chose some of the pieces, measured them, and made a model and design. And then we brought them down and set them in place where I had them intended to. You see there are rough pieces. This is a negative form of a column. This is a positive part of a column. Yeah. And you see all the saw marks, and these were all abandoned pieces.
Yes. It is very astonishing in a certain way that people even accepted the thing like that.
Yes, but in space design, in the environment, or to design an environment with it, so that you can use it, walk through and sit in it, and live in it, see it from various angles. The children, of course, love it.
In some ways, this ceaselessly inventive man was far ahead of his time. He designed an earthwork sculpture in 1940, a quarter of a century before earthworks began to fill the art magazines in New York. He designed walk-in sculptures and space paintings, works for people to be in, to touch, to experience firsthand. And he envisaged a sculpture that would react with the sea, a sea sculpture.
It utilizes the force and motion of the waves breaking against the massive concrete barrier. The various sculptured forms are designed to make the water conform to their curved surfaces and thereby making it into a kinetic design.
His love for the sea, his love for all of nature, influencing everything he does, combines with the other love, which is a constant in his life, a love for painting.
There was a time when Gary Cooper used to visit Aspen, and we became friends, and I said to him, I would like very much to sketch some wild birds, but you cannot do that out in nature. So someday I came back from the studio to the house, and there was a little cardboard box, and I opened it up. There were two little owls in. I took one or the other into the studio, sat them on the back of a chair, you know, and they watched me whatever I did, you know. I turned around, I walked around the room, they followed me with their head. And I left the cage open at night so that they could fly out, and they always came back into the cage.
During the 50s, much of Bayer's painting came to be dominated by a fascination with line and space. The result was a series of works he called linear structures. Shapes, symbolic of the infinite, the eternal, were added above the structures, which symbolized man's activity down below. In the 1960s, Bayer entered a somber period, when most of his work became monochromatic. But then, when he traveled for the first time to North Africa, he experienced a renewal of inspiration, a reawakening to the world of color.
My particular color experiences of recent years go back to a visit to Morocco. It was the power of the sudden character of Morocco with its isolated accents of bright colors against the purifying background of white in the buildings and in the people's dress. The strong contrasts of sun and dark shadows, which opened again my eyes to the world of pure color.
Working once again with a full spectrum of clear colors and primary forms, Bayer has become intrigued with the characteristics of chromatic progressions, bold color abstractions based on geometric measurements.
Mathematical progressions are often the starting point of motifs to my paintings and sculptures. I have used regular progressions such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. But I more often used the progression of Fibonacci, a 12th century mathematician, whose system for his progression is a series of numbers resulting from the addition of the two preceding numbers. I have here on the easel a painting, a sketch for a painting, which is again based on two progressions, a horizontal one and a vertical one. I can show you a sketch of what this painting is planned to be when it is finished.
The possibilities for interplay of line and color available in chromatic progressions present Bayer with an endless variety of compositions. It would be logical to assume that Herbert Bayer, like many other artists, would consider his work to be most importantly a form of self-expression. But this would be to miss the greater meaning of what he has done. For Bayer's philosophy goes beyond considerations of self.
I do not think that self-expression is of any importance. I think this is a misunderstanding. If I produce something, I am not expressing myself. I'm expressing the other thing which I am producing. I believe there is a higher power which produces these things through me. I am a medium. All nature is spirit. All nature is made by God. So we are part of it too. But we can only operate by having life, by being alive. And life is something that is being given. It cannot be made. If a religious man-to-nature relationship was lost in the wake of progress, then we must capture and develop a balanced attitude between our outlook on the man-made and on the natural. In respecting nature, it will continue to be magical and poetic. The artist should not imitate nature, but create a spiritual world of itself side by side with nature. To me, the artist is a mirror in which one sees what one would not see without him.
And has he now, in his 75th year, completed his work? Has he said all he has to say? Not according to Bayer.
And like to see all this as the foundation and preparation for future work, because it is not his past achievements, but the idea of becoming and the creative act itself which impels the artist. It is all a search for something unknown.
A search which has left an indelible mark upon artistic design in the 20th century. The mark of Herbert Bayer, the man and his work.